a vast, ancient swamp world shrouded in perpetual mist and twilight, where murky waters stretch endlessly, filled with twisted roots, towering trees, and strange creatures. Life clings to every shadowy corner, evolving slowly in the depths of greenish fog, forging survival and discovery in the heart of an untamed, primordial wilderness. Chapter 1. The First Light. Long ago, in the murky, warm waters of the endless swamp, tiny, shimmering flecks of life began to appear. They were simple, just single-celled organisms drifting in the gloom, floating along, feeding on the rich minerals seeping up from the depths. They multiplied and formed colonies. Each one clung to life in its own way, adapting to the world around it, thriving wherever it could find a speck of sunlight or nutrient-rich mud. And so, life took its first timid steps in the swamp. Chapter 2. The Green Drift. As ages passed, these simple organisms gathered together, forming green patches of algae. At first they were thin and delicate, barely holding together, but over time they grew thicker, forming floating islands of green mats. These algae blankets drifted slowly across the swamp, clinging to life at the water's surface, absorbing every bit of sunlight they could. These mats became the first refuge, a place where other tiny creatures could hide and thrive. Life was still simple, but it was beginning to spread. Chapter 3. The Roots Reach Out. From the murky water's depths, new life started to rise. Primitive plants with long, thin roots that reached down to the swamp bed. These were the first trees, sturdy and flexible, their roots like fingers, anchoring them in the mud. They grew tall and spread their leaves across the water, casting shadows and creating a cool, sheltered world below. Underneath these trees, life began to flourish, finding a sanctuary from the unyielding heat. The swamp was no longer just a soup of life. It was becoming an ecosystem, rich and full. Chapter 4. The Silent Hunters. In the shadows beneath the roots, new creatures began to emerge. Small, finned hunters with sharp senses and swift movements. They were cautious, darting between roots and fallen leaves, using their fins to propel themselves in quick, silent bursts. With each generation, they grew larger, more agile, their bodies adapting to slip between the twisted roots. These hunters quickly became the swamp's rulers, feeding on smaller creatures and keeping the balance of life in check. They were the first to develop awareness, learning to sense movement and danger, honing their instincts to survive. Chapter 5. The Rise of Crawlers. One day, something remarkable happened. Some of these hunters, driven by curiosity or hunger, began to explore beyond the water. They wriggled onto the thick algae mats and logs that floated on the swamp surface. Over time, their bodies adapted, and they developed simple, stubby legs to help them crawl across the mats. These were the crawlers, the first creatures to live both in and out of the water. They explored the swamp's tangled terrain, finding food in new places and learning to avoid predators in the ever-shifting world of mud and roots. Chapter 6. The Climbing Ones. The crawlers thrived, but soon some of them began to seek higher ground. They climbed up the roots of the trees, finding safety and food in the leaves above. These pioneers developed strong arms and flexible tails, allowing them to grip branches and swing between the tree roots. They became known as the climbers, nimble and curious, their vision sharp to spot danger from afar. In the canopy, they found freedom and a new world to explore. Life was becoming more complex, with creatures living in the swamp on its surface and now in its towering trees. Chapter 7. The Glimmers emerge. In the dense canopy of the swamp, the climbers began to change. As they communicated through gestures and calls, they developed simple patterns of light along their scales. They became the Glimmers, named for their bioluminescent signals that they used to speak to one another in the dim swamp light. They learned to warn each other of danger, to signal food sources, and even to show affection. The Glimmers started building simple nests and tools, weaving vines together for strength and structure. This was the first society, a network of families and groups that worked and lived together. Chapter 8: The First Stories. Generations passed, and the Glimmers' lives became richer and more complex. They created signals and calls to share more than just danger or food. They began sharing memories. They whispered stories of the great roots below, of the crawlers who once ruled the waters, and of the green drift, the endless mats of algae that had been the first life. Their stories passed from one generation to the next, shaping a shared understanding of their world. They believed the swamp had given them life and that it held endless secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 9: The Age of Exploration. The Glimmers began to wonder about the lands beyond their home trees. Small groups ventured out, building rafts from fallen logs and woven vines. Using spears they had crafted to protect themselves, they encountered other Glimmer clans, different in subtle ways, each with its own customs and stories. Some met in peace, others clashed over territory, but all learned from each encounter. Over time, they exchanged knowledge, learning to map the stars they could faintly see through the fog and to track the patterns of the swamp's currents. Chapter 10: The Keepers of the Swamp. The Glimmers grew wiser, understanding that they were part of the swamp, bound to it. They knew the songs of every bird, the splash of every fish, and the sigh of the trees as the winds passed. Their elders became keepers of knowledge, telling tales of the swamp's ancient past, teaching the young to respect the balance of life and to cherish the mysteries that still lay beneath the murky water. Together, they stood as the intelligent stewards of their world, their bioluminescent scales glowing softly in the green twilight, guiding each other and honoring the endless, mysterious swamp that had given them life. And so, from single-celled organisms to intelligent beings, the world of the swamp had evolved, each step building upon the last, each creature leaving its mark in the rich tapestry of life. The swamp was no longer just a place. It was a home, a story, and a legacy.